Okay, so we are going to get started. Can everyone hear me fine? Perfect. Um, Hello and welcome. I'm Aditi Srivastava. I am the tax policy researcher with Policy Matters Ohio, and I'm really excited for everyone to join me at the Revenue Roundtable, which we're reconvening after hiatus in part because of recent changes to the state's property tax system and threats to repeal property taxes altogether, all of which we'll discuss today. This is the first of a monthly series, and so after this meeting, we should send out an email sometime soon of when the next one is in February, and we hope to see you there as well. Could we head to the next slide, Kate? So the agenda for this meeting, we're kind of parted down a bit. Property taxes as a subject could be the focus of multiple revenue roundtable sessions, but for today, we're focusing on property taxes one-on-one, the recent legislation that's just passed, the ballot initiative to eliminate property taxes and a road for meaningful relief. Some light housekeeping that I want to touch on is that the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session will be a Q&A, and that we will be recording the presentation part of the session, but not the Q&A. And the slides we will be using today will be shared out with some additional resources after the session. Next slide, please. So property taxes one-on-one. And next one, please. Property taxes in our community. I think when we're delving into tax policy, it's really easy to lose the narrative in the numbers. And so it's really crucial to ground any policy discussion, tax policy discussion, in what the revenue funds and how it appears in our communities and our everyday lives. Unlike the state sales and income tax, property taxes go almost entirely back into the communities that they're collected from. Some of the key services that they fund include schools, libraries, parks, emergency medical services, fire departments, county health and human services, police and local law enforcement, and then infrastructure. The pie chart that you see illustrates the rough breakdown of how property taxes that were collected were allocated in the state in tax year 2024. Tax year, by the way, just generally refers to the 12-month calendar year, so January 1st to December 31st. But you'll notice that a majority of the collections went to school districts, about 2/3. And let's look a little bit further into that. Could we go to the next slide, please? The share of school annual revenue that came from property taxes, as mentioned, is about 2/3. And the property tax amounts that fund their annual kind of budget will depend district to district. You can find this information, by the way, in a school district's financial forecast report. But for example, property taxes accounted for over 80% of Rocky River School District's annual revenue. And you might wonder why property taxes constitute such a large portion of a school district's funding. And while we're not going to get into the topic of school funding extensively in this presentation, it's something that I do think we need to touch on. The reliance on property taxes for this funding stems back to Rolfe v. State, a landmark Ohio Supreme Court case that declared that Ohio's school funding system was unconstitutional for failing to provide a thorough and efficient system for common schools. The ruling required the legislature to overhaul school financing to reduce over-reliance on local property taxes. There were attempts made to restructure the funding formula, and in 2021, Ohio took a step in adopting a predictable, fair, and rational formula, the Fair School Funding Plan. The plan is built on the foundation of answering how much does it cost to educate a child in the state, and it was intended to be enacted in financial year 2027, but it's only been partially enacted, and we don't look like we're on track to have it enacted by the time that was expected. And so that's part of the reason that property taxes constitute so much of school funding and kind of why that's continued to be the case. Can we head to the next slide? And so we've discussed a bit now about what property taxes fund. Let's rewind and get into some of the building blocks needed to engage with the property tax debate. Millage. So we're starting with how we measure property tax rates, millage. And if you see a discussion about millage, the discussion is probably on property taxes. That's what it's used for generally. And you can remember that my fun way is you need millage to fund a village. And so if you see that, that's how you know it's property taxes. 1 mil equals $1 of tax for every $1,000 of property's value. And so if your property is taxable, uh, if your property is taxable or assessed value is $100,000, the millage rate is 20, and the millage rate is 20 mils, you'll pay $20 for every $1,000 of taxable value. And if you've been keeping up with the property tax debate for the last year, you probably noticed the focus on inside versus outside millage. To put it simply, inside millage are unvoted millage, meaning that the local taxing authority does not need to go to the voters for this millage. Inside millage is authorized by Ohio Constitution, it are authorized within the Ohio Constitution, and on average, 4.7 mils of inside millage is levied by school districts. And inside millage accounted for about $4 billion in tax year 2024. Um, and it provided 24.5 million in essential services to 50 public health departments, and half of them don't have a separate tax levy. So it's a substantial part of their budget. And townships across the state, which depend heavily on property taxes, were due 457 million in inside millage last year. And so just to say that this is kind of a crucial source of funding for a lot of these services across the state. Outside millage, on the other hand, is something that voters have to approve. And so the kind of way inside and outside millage is set up has meant over time that certain entities kind of have to keep going back to voters for their funding. And we can talk about that in the next slide. So perhaps some of you are familiar with House Bill 920, but it's part of the reason that even though property tax values have risen across the state, property tax bills haven't necessarily rose as much. House Bill 920 was designed to prevent inflation-driven spikes in property taxes for residents. In many cases, voters approve dollar amounts at the ballot box, not tax rates. So House Bill 920 was passed to protect kind of many voted in taxes from inflation. It requires that property values increase during state mandated reappraisals. Tax rates for voted levies are automatically reduced so that taxing districts, schools, libraries, and local governments collect roughly the same amount of revenue in the year as the levy was passed. So, in other words, higher home values don't automatically mean higher taxes for many voted levies. Your obligation is locked at the value that your obligation is locked at the value of your home at the time that the levy was passed. And to kind of give you a bit of an example, in Cuyahoga County, the approved tax rate is 14.85 mils, but the effective rate was reduced to 12.26 mils to account for the inflation and rising property values. And so that's just an example of how that works. But yeah, it means that kind of even as the property values are going up, it's not that these services are getting necessarily more money in accordance with that. And so let's talk about House Bill 920 and school funding for a second. Okay. House Bill 920 was heavily criticized for freezing property tax revenue on voted levies, preventing schools and local governments from receiving automatic funding increases when property values rise due to inflation. And it has led to kind of frequent, often unpopular ballot levies to maintain services and meet rising costs. The 20 mil floor in Ohio is a funding mechanism to ensure that school districts receive a minimum of 20 mils of inside and voted property tax revenue. Originally, emergency levies and substitute levies were not factored into this floor. And in tax year 2024, 407 out of 611 Ohio school districts were on the floor. One way that I heard it referenced to that I thought was helpful was House Bill 920 meant that if kind of property tax values were getting hot, it was to keep kind of the oven from breaking, but make sure that it didn't cool down to the point that like school districts were affected. And so that I thought was kind of helpful to visualize how that worked. And so we can now move to property tax totals. It's something we'll delve into later in the presentation, but I think it's really important to wrap our heads around just how much revenue this brings in and kind of how it's split across real property taxes and public utility tangible personal property owners. And so in tax year 2024, 26.93 billion was brought in through property taxes. 21.41 billion was charged to real property owners, and then 2.52 charged to public utility tangible property owners. And then next slide. And so you might ask, what is real property? What does that mean? Real property is anything permanently attached. Real property is land and anything permanently attached to it. So it's Ohio's oldest tax, and it's been ad valorem tax, meaning it's a tax based on values since 1825. Movable items such as standard window air conditioners, detachable appliances, removable fixtures are not treated as real property. There's two classes of real property, residential, agricultural, and then commercial, industrial, and mineral. And so if you're paying property taxes, you're most likely paying kind of taxes on real property. And then we can move to the next one. And so the question is, what are you paying on for your property tax bill? Kind of if your house's value is like, I don't know, 500,000, are you paying on that full 500,000? Most folks in the room, again, pay real property taxes. So if you pay your property taxes directly in this way, it's important to note that you're not paying on the market value. So you're not paying on, I think, like what the value determined by the auditor is. You're paying on 35% of that value, which is the assessed or taxable value. In Ohio, all properties are fully reappraised every 6 years, and values are adjusted every 3 years. And so if the auditor appraises your home's value at $200,000, the home's taxable property value would be 70,000, which is the 200,000 times 0.35. And then 1 mil would levy $70. And you can kind of see that example there. It's a bit unusual that we reappraise every 6 years and that's adjusted every 3 years. The full reappraisal means that I think there's like more inspections done and the 3 year kind of reappraisal is done based on statistics, but a lot of states tend to do it every year. And so that's in part why you see spikes in your bills compared to people whose properties are assessed every year. So those bills kind of match those reappraisals year by year. Next slide, please. So the other kind of category from real property tax is the public utility tangible personal property. And this is more necessary to kind of discuss something later in the presentation, but if you do need a tongue twister, I would recommend trying to say public utility tangible personal property like 5 times. But it is collected on public utilities. So it's the machinery, equipment, pipes, wires, structures used for service delivery by these types of utility providers. And utility providers are kind of defined further. I think it's like telegraph companies, electric companies, heating companies. And so you're not paying this directly, but the cost of this tax is often passed on to you. There used to be a larger tax on tangible personal property, on businesses more generally, but that was repealed in 2005. And so this is kind of what we have left. Next slide, please. So we're now moving into the recent legislation. Hopefully, kind of the last section has given you a bit of information as to how some of these different things work. And then we can now move into how this legislation might be moving, how some of these mechanisms, policy mechanisms, work in the future. So to start, House Bill 309. House Bill 309 has kind of authorized county budget commissioners to annually review and adjust levies to avoid unnecessary and excessive collections. These commissioners are elected, but it's uncertain kind of how closely they work with a lot of the agencies that receive property taxes. And so there is a bit of uncertainty and caution in terms of what's going to be determined as unnecessary and excessive. So when you approve a levy, it is going to be kind of in place for the first year, but these commissioners can change the nature of the levy after the first year. And so we kind of see it as broadly undemocratic. These levies were approved by voters and can be rolled back without voter consent within a year. In the last kind of election cycle, we saw levies across the state get, approved at really high rates, considering this narrative that property taxes are too high and people don't want to pay them. And so I think there is an intent by voters to preserve these kind of services and things in their community that they benefit from. Um, let's move to House Bill 186, please. House Bill 186. House Bill 186 limits the increases in school districts that are on the 20 mil floor. And so we touched on the 20 mil floor earlier, but these are the school districts whose inside millage plus kind of expense levies are just meeting that kind of minimum amount. And it's like an overwhelming amount of school districts where like 400 something out of 600 were at that floor. It returns hundreds of millions in property taxes to owners in that district through tax credits. And so it's pulling that money essentially kind of out of the coffers of these schools to issue these credits. It's granted to real property tax owners to the extent that their school districts revenue exceeds relevant inflation measures. And it is going to cost kind of an exorbitant amount in the coming years. The state is doing a backfill payment to prevent losses on school districts in financial year 2027 and 2028. But we will start, I think, seeing kind of the effects of this bill come into play near and after those periods. And then can we move on? Oh, thank you. One of the interesting things about House Bill 186 is they snuck in a provision that eliminated a 10% non-business credit on non-agricultural properties, an increase in owner-occupied credit from 2.5% to 15.38%. What this means is that while it will help owner occupants, it's mostly going to help kind of owners of expensive homes. And the landlords who are no longer going to be receiving that 10% credit may pass on that kind of loss of the credit to the renter in terms of like a rent increase. And so there's kind of the school element of it, but also this part of it. Dipping back into the school side of it, one of the interesting things is that how it offers relief across the state is not very even. So mentioned in the last slide, but there are owners who live in Indian Hill, which is in some measures kind of the wealthiest district in Ohio. They will be receiving relief, but not necessarily owners in East Cleveland, which by kind of those same measures are in the poorest district. And many of the schools that are on the 20 mil floor tend to be kind of rural, small school districts. And so people living in cities are not receiving relief. And it's not, again, it's just not very targeted. The flip side of that is those schools are not having funds pulled. And so school districts in kind of larger cities like Cleveland, Akron, Columbus, and Cincinnati will not likely be affected as much by this. And then let's move to House Bill 335. House Bill 335 limits the growth of inside millage by the gross domestic product deflator over the next 3 years. The gross domestic product deflator, the GDP deflator, measures inflation by comparing the nominal GDP or the current prices to the real GDP, the constant prices. But it's going to reduce state millage revenue by approximately like several hundreds of millions of dollars in the coming years. It's not targeted relief, and it doesn't really get to the root of providing property tax relief to the people who need it the most. And then we can move to 129. House Bill 129 counts current expense and fixed some levies towards the school's 20 mil floor or 2 mil floor for kind of joint vocational districts starting in 2026. And so as you remember, like before, these types of levies did not kind of count to that amount of minimum funding that a school district was considered to have. So it adds emergency substitute growth and conversion levies to that floor calculation. And it limits new fixed sum levies to current operating expenses only. It's really interesting for House Bill 129. It actually kind of decreases the number of schools at the 20 mil floor And so combined with the effects of 186, there's less revenue loss than expected because there's just not as many school districts at the 20 mil floor. Um, and so we can move to the next one. So all of this has happened. It's about $3 billion of revenue loss. And so then the question is, did this provide relief? Did this solve the issue? What issue did it solve? Let's get to kind of the backdrop of it. So the narrative leading up to these bills passing and kind of the deliberation of them was that Ohio has these exorbitant property tax rates, that the property tax system is breaking, that people are seeing these massive bills and it's uncertain whether relief is coming soon. Did these kind of series of bills actually solve, what the narrative said? Short answer is no, and we can kind of look at that further in the next slide. So when looking at kind of property tax bills and if it is kind of overwhelming some people, it's really important to maybe consider this from the point of the percentage of the bill as a person's income. And so according to Smart Asset, while Ohio's effective property tax rate was relatively high at 1.22%, both property values and the amounts residents pay annually in property taxes remains below the national medians. So while property tax rates are a problem for many Ohioans, it's not as extreme as a share of income. And you can kind of see the ITEP chart below. And so the bottom row is kind of the different quintiles of kind of income groups in Ohio. And overall, property taxes, at least in 2024, were not exceeding more than kind of 3 to 4% of a person's income. This, we want to make sure to state, is not the case for everybody. And there are genuinely some folks in Ohio that are facing really high property tax bills. The issue is that this legislation that just passed does not actually target relief to the people who need it. And so with all of this that's passed, let's talk about kind of the boogeyman in the back that also spurred some of this legislation. The ballot initiative to eliminate property tax. This is something you may have heard kind of in the last year and been wondering kind of where it's going, how it's going. After DeWine signed the bills, these two kind of news articles came out that advocates in the space don't think that the bills did enough. And that this kind of attempt to say that we've offered relief through these kind of four pieces of legislation clearly didn't hit the mark. And so that's $3 billion of revenue loss. And for what? What does this property tax elimination measure mean? Let's look at that for a second. So this initiative proposes a constitutional amendment to abolish taxes on real property in Ohio. So as you remember, this was the larger chunk of the two kind of sums of money brought in through property taxes overall. So it does not impact the personal utility tax. If the amendment makes it onto the ballot and is supported by voters in November, it'll first apply in tax year 2027. It's led for a group called Citizens for Property Tax Reform and Committee to Abolish Ohio property taxes. It's unclear as of now kind of if they're funded beyond just a grassroots group, but at the moment it looks like they are kind of like smaller groups across the state. The group would need to collect more than 400,000 signatures from at least half of Ohio's 88 counties before the measure can move forward. Next slide, please. So we are kind of seeing revenue loss across the board from these four bills, and it's likely going to impact schools the most. Eliminating property taxes is a whole other beast. Let's start with kind of the impact on townships. And so 1/3 of Ohio residents live in townships. Townships don't levy income or sales taxes, meaning you still pay the state income and sales tax, but not a local one. Township voters have approved about 3,190 property tax levies statewide to fund police, fire, and EMS services. And they're responsible for thousands of miles of roads and over 2,000 cemeteries across Ohio. One thing I'm going to say for this section is we are releasing a report at the moment that will be linked in our resources called Ohio Property Taxes Repeals Would Gut School Budgets and Local Services. And if you would like to learn kind of more about the impact of the ballot initiative in particular, I would highly recommend looking into that. So next is kind of the impact on utilities. Again, the amendment only repeals real property taxes. So the public utility tangible personal property tax would still continue on. If the property taxes on real property are abolished, the taxpayers in the second category would be required to cover the remaining amount of fixed sum levies. Fixed sum levies are levies that voters approve on an exact dollar amount. So it could be like $2 million a year. The tax rate changes year to year to raise that exact amount. So as property values rise, the millage goes down. If values fall, the millage goes up. And so this rate, if you can kind of look at the chart, is the kind of 2.5 billion. And tangible personal property taxes happen to bring in about the same rate. So to cover this fixed sum levy, they would have to double the amount that is collected through the personal utility, personal property tax. Um, and so in order to double that, that would likely mean that they would have to shift an enormous amount of that cost onto consumers, i.e., utility rates would likely go up across the state. And at the moment where there's kind of been fervor around like the data center crisis and kind of the energy and utility impacts, that's something to really keep an eye on. Um, and then we can move on to local services. So we've talked about the impacts on townships and on utilities. Then to kind of cap it off, we'll distill to like the most local level. So cuts would threaten local services across the board. As mentioned earlier, health and human services depend heavily and sometimes entirely on property taxes. So services would not only be heavily affected, they may cease to exist. Um, and again, I would recommend reading our report that's coming out on this to understand further. But the long story short of it is that an amendment like this, if it were to come to pass, would alter kind of the fabric of Ohio and local communities in Ohio. So that is a lot. Let's take a step back and maybe kind of think about, um, you know, uh, think about how we could actually solve this problem and provide meaningful relief. Could we move to the next slide, Kate? So if the bills to provide sufficient uh, relief have not really brought about the intended outcome, and the elimination of property taxes would devastate the state, the question is, what now? And that leads us into making up the lost revenue. Um, so first and foremost, the real property tax is more than kind of all of the other local taxes combined. And so raising that amount is incredibly difficult. Revenue from major state taxes, also like the state sales tax and the income tax, individually do not raise as much as the real property tax. And that's just kind of starting to show that if this was repealed, the effort to replace it would be near impossible. Can we move to the next slide? Replacing the real property tax would require an extreme sales hike. Doubling the sales tax would be insufficient to make up with the sales tax. The average overall rate would have to be raised, so it would be more than 14%, which would be the highest in the nation. I come from Tennessee, where the sales tax rate is like 9.8%, and I believe that's like second or third highest. And so this would be kind of a whole other type of question. Look, large increases in both income and sales taxes would leave most counties with a combined sales tax rate of 10% or higher, including 11% in major counties facing income rates of above 25% where sales tax is over 18%. And I guess it could be possible to replace it if you were to kind of switch the rates to this, but such increases are politically unrealistic, and it would just leave such kind of deep cuts to education and public services that I think picking up the pieces and actually trying to create a working budget after this would be immensely difficult. Uh, so moving to the next one. I jumped the gun a bit earlier. Now we're on the road for meaningful relief. So the bills have not provided sufficient relief. Eliminating property taxes are devastating. Where do we go from here? First is to fund schools fairly. I mentioned the Fair School Funding Plan, and as said, we're not on track to actually meet the goal of 2027. A report last year from Fleeter and Browning concluded that Ohio dropped to 35th in the nation in state share for K through 12 revenue in 2002 to 45th in 2023. The Fair School Funding Plan works because it's based on the actual cost of educating kids. It shares the cost between state and local communities by considering communities' ability to cover costs through local taxes. And for this 2-year budget period, and to cover the cost through local taxes. For the 2-year budget period, failing to implement the plan has underfunded public schools by over $2.7 billion. It places the responsibility of funding schools on everyday Ohioans and property taxes rather than the state. So to fund this in a way through kind of other tax means, especially through income tax, which is more closely linked to a person's ability to pay, would shift the responsibility, would shift the kind of heaviness off of property taxes. And then second solution. So the second thing we recommend is a circuit breaker. And this is something that if you've kind of kept up with our work, you may have seen as a kind of reoccurring thing, but Ohio families are facing high property tax bills should have targeted relief for them. So what a property tax circuit breaker does is it links tax bills to a person's ability to pay, issuing a tax credit, which is paid by the state rather than through school coffers, if their bill exceeds a set percentage of their income. The income percentage and the maximum credit issued are adjustable. The circuit breaker could also extend relief to renters, which is unique and something we don't have in Ohio currently. And 29 states, both blue and red, have an active circuit breaker policy. One thing that I think just that sets the circuit breaker apart is really that piece on renters. Currently, we have something called a homestead exemption, and that's only for owner-occupied properties, meaning that you own and live in your house. And it's typically only more kind of specifically for the elderly and people who are disabled. And so we have some form of property tax relief, but it's incredibly narrow. And it just excludes renters, which in an environment where renting is becoming increasingly common, needs to be considered as a facet for relief. And then the fourth thing, be aware of and don't sign any petitions seeking to abolish property taxes. Currently, this group is collecting signatures across the state, and they have not met their count to actually have it on the ballot for November. One thing to keep in mind is if they don't make the kind of signature count for November, they could apply for next November. This does not necessarily die with them not getting enough signatures this year. But they, I believe, are not quite halfway, but still kind of steadily collecting signatures. So it's important to be aware of kind of this issue. One other thing to keep in mind is that this may change as the gubernatorial candidates announce their policy positions. So that's just something else to kind of keep an eye out on. And then the last bit. So we've talked about property taxes and property tax relief and property tax legislation, but one thing that I think is really important in a broader conversation around this is why has the responsibility of paying for these crucial services been so heavily placed on kind of individual Hawaiians, primarily through property taxes. And state policy changes have shifted the property tax burden away from businesses onto homeowners, and farmers. And it's a change that's occurred per capita. as per capita income in Ohio has fallen below the national average. As mentioned, Ohio used to have a personal tangible property taxes on businesses more generally. We used to have a corporate income tax as well. And as those have kind of gone away, there's been a greater responsibility shifted onto everyday Ohioans. And that leads into my last slide. So this is a graph that's pulled from our Great Ohio Tax Shift Report that should be coming out very soon, that I heavily recommend that you check out. But this is how the tax cuts that have been passed since 2005 have kind of fallen and impacted different income groups. As you can see, the top 1% has received a lion's share of kind of tax cuts passed since that time, while the lowest 20% of income earners in Ohio have only received $32. No, have their taxes go up by $32. And so while the top 1% could buy a really nice car for the average person, they might have to skip out on two sandwiches and a bit. And for the next kind of income groups, as you can see, there's still some tax cuts that they've received, but it's not substantial compared to the top 20 and top 1%. Overall, this shows that we have been shifting the responsibility of paying for these services again away from the wealthy who can afford to pay and onto everyday Ohioans, primarily in the sense of kind of putting more responsibility on things like income and property tax for these groups. So again, I recommend you check out this report, and I thank you for joining me for our first revenue roundtable on property taxes. I hope you found this helpful. As we move into the Q&A session, it will not be recorded.